Okay, so this week we are starting in with phylogenetic analysis, and really with this I'm going to begin with talking about phylogenetic trees, how to interpret them, how to misinterpret them. I'll also talk a little bit about their calculation maybe today, and give you an assignment to get done before tomorrow evening so that we can have it done by lab. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So this is a person. This person's name is Philippe Padoux. And Philippe Padoux in 2006 was living in Texas, and his girlfriend of 4 years at this point, 2006, discovers that, or catches him with another woman. And she decides to break up with him. Makes sense. So she does, and she takes. He had lost his job recently, and she was providing things, lots of things for him, including his cell phone. So she gets all of her things back, including his cell phone back. At her annual checkup the following week, she discovers she has HPV. Not very fun. So what she begins to do is get that phone that she had recovered from him, and decides to call the other girl that he had been sleeping with, and decides to say, hey, maybe you should get yourself checked. And he does it, and she actually finds out, oh, it's just not this one girl, it's another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And so they begin to get themselves checked. Actually, all those women actually meet up as well, and kind of compare notes on this guy, end up actually taking a picture of themselves, having lunch together, and send it to him. But anyways, one of them goes in and has a full set of full STD panel, and actually finds out she also has HIV. And so the rest of the women start to get checked as well. And it turns out several of them, many of them, had HIV as well. And they report this to the county health authority. The county health authority issues him a cease and desist order to stop having uninformed and unprotected sex with people, which he subsequently ignores and continues to have intercourse with many people, apparently. And after that happens, he is arrested, and there's a trial. It actually turns out that he's infected at least 7 people, and in the course of this, during the course of the trial, they actually had to demonstrate that, okay, these people didn't get HIV to some other random place. That was actually this individual. That was the person who infected them, and they did that using phylogenetics. And this is a little bit hard to read, but this is, the proof is right there. You can see it, right? We'll come back to this later in the class, and come back to it. But this actually fairly demonstrably shows that Philippe Padoux was the source of the infections that all these other women had. And we'll come back to exactly how this shows that in a little bit, but with that, we're going to kind of get rolling with phylogenetics. So phylogenetics, just to kind of define this, is the study of the evolutionary history and relationships among individuals or groups of organisms. Now, I am going to mention one caveat here just for a moment. The idea behind phylogenetics, or one of the underlying assumptions to everything that we're doing in phylogenetics, is that the organisms that we are looking at do have a common ancestor. Now that does raise a whole bunch of things in a classroom at the school, and for this moment, I need to lay those aside because that will open up an entire box that honestly we don't really have time to delve into in this. There is so much to cover without going into that. For the sake of this, because this is a really important concept in biology, in fact, going forward, understanding of phylogenetics and how people arrived at phylogenetic trees and interpretation of phylogenetic trees is insanely important and becoming even more important. I am going to be speaking in the context that that assumption is true because we need to be able to move through these techniques, but I am speaking in that because this is the context of these methods. I'm not trying to support or do anything specifically endorsing any particular view. This is simply the frame that we're in. The relationships then between these organisms are expressed in this phylogenetic tree. And phylogenetic trees look a little something like this. I'm going to start talking about how they are, the components of it. But one thing I will kind of mention here first off is there's lots of misunderstandings and miscommunications or misconceptions about what does or what are the ideas that a phylogenetic tree expresses. And I want to go through a lot of those as we go through this, but I also want to kind of preface this, some of this should be reviewed from general biology. I know general biology went through some of this, and I won't try to belabor those points too awfully long. So in a phylogenetic tree, what you have here is you have the tips of these, and each thing at the very end, each of these letters is a taxa, or an individual sample that you have, that you've run this analysis on. Singular taxa, or singular taxon, multiple taxa. Then each one of these branching points, these points where a single line splits into two lines, is a thing called a node. Hypothetically, at this node, there is represented the most recent common ancestor of the two organisms that are represented on the taxa that grow from that, or have arisen from that node. Or in the case of this, the three taxa, or however many taxa then are then down from this node. This is the most recent, or represents the most recent common ancestor of those organisms. Also, we have this structure called a branch. The branch is essentially all of the parts of the tree that are downstream, or in this case, it's looking up, but of a particular node. So it is a node plus all of its some quote-unquote descendants. So if we take this node plus all of its descendants, this is this branch. One other thing that I do want to talk about here is the idea of something being nested within a branch or within another group. In this case, for instance, C here is nested within this group here because it is inside of it. At the exact same time, B is nested within this group as well, so is D. E is nested within this whole group, or this branch. F is the same. Now, this is a tree that is what we call fully resolved, because every single node has only two unique descendants coming directly off of that node. So if you look at this node, we have two branches coming off of there. If we look at this node, it what we call bifurcates. Every single branch bifurcates. So we have two branches coming off of there. And this is ideally where you like to get these two. You would like them to all be bifurcating branches. However, we can also have a tree that looks like this, where one of the branches actually has three branches coming off a single node. So the node is essentially here, and we have these three branches coming off of that. This is what is called a polytomy. And this tree then would be what we call not fully resolved or partially resolved. We don't actually have, and what causes this is we don't have sufficient information to tell exactly. We know that D, C, and B are more related to each other than they are to everything else, but we don't know is that the exact relationships between those three. I guess one thing I kind of took for granted, but I think I do mention that a little bit later, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Also, there are multiple ways that you can draw the exact same tree. And one of them is that any one of these nodes can be flipped, and it's the exact same tree. It doesn't change the relationships at all. So for instance, this is the tree that we've just been looking at. If we flip this node right here, we get a tree that looks like this. This is the exact same tree. Because if you look at C and B are still most closely related to each other. D is equally closely related to C and B, but more distant from E and F and more distant from A. So any given node, you can imagine each of these being like essentially a little swivel, and you can spin any of them any way that you like, and you get the exact same tree. It doesn't change anything. Okay, so let's look at how patterns of relatedness work on a tree. And one of the things I want to point out here is that this should be fairly review for you at this point, but organisms that are closer to each other on the tree, and by closer I mean if you look down the branch and then back up. Organisms that are closer to each other on the tree are more related to each other. So for instance here, D is more closely related to C, or B, excuse me, even though in space, D is more closely in space to E, it is more closely related to B on this phylogeny. The reason for that is that if you follow this back, you have a shorter path to get to B than you do to get to E. Does that make sense? Okay, so the relatedness is based on the distance away from each other, but the distance is not just literal distance or direct distance apart. It's through the branching back through the tree. Or actually, the better way to think about this, or essentially a different way to think about the exact same thing is, at what distance, at what time period back is the most recent common ancestor? So, most recent common ancestor between B and D is this node. Most recent common ancestor between D and E is at this node right back here. Okay, so let's put this into like a little bit different context, like a family tree type of context, and let's start talking a little bit about what, or some ideas and relatedness on phylogenetic trees. So here we have a phylogenetic tree that has you, has some hypothetical sibling that you have. It has your first cousin and then a couple second cousins. Hooray. Look at that. Get all warm and fuzzy feelings looking at all your family up there like that. We can flip it this way. This is, again, the exact same tree. Just to kind of illustrate to you, if I do this or this, that tree has not changed at all. It's the exact same tree. Whoa, but that is a different tree. So we come back here, and we have first cousin, sibling, and you. And so this is relatedness, and then also one thing I want to point out, as you go back down the tree in many trees, this is going back essentially in time. So if we look at now relatedness here, where would your parents be?
That first node, right, between sibling and you.
Yes, so this is your parents. Where would your grandparents be? Yes, so here are your grandparents. Where would your aunt be? The what?
The node over the second cousins.
This one? That would be a great aunt. Oh wait, no, that'd be a first cousin once removed. Yeah.
Oh, so it would be like in between the grandparents and the first cousin.
Right here. Yes, exactly. Okay, so this illustrates one point that I want to talk about. In this, okay, so we're not exactly talking about species here, but we're talking about individuals. All individuals, and on a bigger phylogenetic tree, all species are not represented on every single tree. There's not a node for every single one of them. You can have a long line here that represents many different species or many different individuals in this case. There is a person that's right here. The only reason they show up is because we only have plotted on here one descendant of that individual. And so there's no node because there's only one descendant. We don't have to split anything. It's a direct lineage. But that doesn't mean now that there are any less organisms or any less species or anything else like that in between here. It doesn't represent that. The simple thing that we're saying is that between this node and this taxa, we only have plotted one individual on here. It also doesn't mean that you don't have other first cousins. Maybe we didn't get the DNA from the other first cousins. Maybe they died earlier in life. There's all sorts of reasons that another first cousin could exist, hypothetically exist out there. We don't have them up here. And so actually this can happen. One of the popular misconceptions, so if we go back to a tree like this, and that you look at this, going from this node all the way back up to A, is that there's been no change. That essentially this is descending with no change all the way from that most recent common ancestor to A, and that is absolutely not the case. In the same way that you had an uncle that completely did not show up on there, you can have lots of different changes. In fact, lots of different species generated that end up producing A that are not showing up on here. So what we're saying here is that this is no different in terms of the amount of change that's happened from here to here, as from here, like the most recent common ancestor to A, compared to the most recent common ancestor to, say, something like F. The only difference is the number of organisms that we have plotted on this. And this is one thing also that I just want to kind of point out. Oftentimes, phylogenetic trees become read like a ladder of progress from left to right, as in most simple, most like the common ancestor, to slightly more complicated, till we get to the pinnacle of everything over on the right. That is completely wrong. It's not representing that at all. The only thing it's representing is a pattern of relatedness between these. And honestly, you can have, in whatever way that you want to mark complexity, most cells, I mean, most intelligent, whatever it is, could be this organism right here. Okay, let's go back here for a second. So again, a long branch does not necessarily mean a species is older. It doesn't mean that it has evolved more. It doesn't mean anything like that. The only thing that means is that we don't have more species plot on that branch.
Is there anything that people do to generate figures to minimize this implicit effect? Like maybe shuffle how they twist the nodes, or even like put a color gradient on the bars?
I've known people, yeah, that have tried, that do. Well, actually, wait, here's the thing. It's like most of the time when people twist the nodes is that they try to get things in relatively clean orders that line up with how they're seeing the tree. And so that other people in the field are like not in the field as in like outside doing field work, but like in that field of research, understand what they're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
The vast majority of phylogeneticists I know are not necessarily making trees for public consumption. So they're
Would
assuming
certainly be different.
yes. And so, or at least that's not their primary reason of making trees. And so their primary reason is to communicate their findings to other researchers and other people in that field. So to that degree, yeah. That I have seen not a ton. I mean, I have known, yeah, you will arrange a tree to make sense, but I don't know if people have like, I have seen people like make trees implicitly or explicitly to disrupt the idea, something like, which whatever bacteria you put in there, that's a completely valid tree. But it also, like the way most people implicitly read these, they would be like, what? That feels wrong to me. Yeah. So. Okay, so next one. Who is more closely related to your first cousin, you or your sibling? Yeah, neither. You are equally distantly related from your first cousin. The reason is, again, we're looking at who has what is the shared most recent common ancestor. For both of you is your grandparents. There's no difference there. And so that's one thing. It's like just looking here to here, it look, oh, maybe like your sibling might be, but no, both of you are equally related to your first cousin. Okay. All of these I've been showing you so far are what are called rooted trees. They have a root. They have this point in which we can anchor them that then we determine what the order of the nodes are. So we know that this node comes earlier than this node, and then this node, I don't know why I put it that way, but it's kind of different. But they're ordered, especially on the same branch, we can tell which one is earlier. This is an unrooted tree. In this case, you can still tell the degree of relatedness. Like, for instance, is D more closely related to E or to C? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
D or C?
Was that, yeah, is D more closely related to E or C? E, yes. And it's just, again, how many nodes you have to pass through. So we go through this node, so it's one node, two node, then we get to C. To E it's just one node, and then to E. So it's more closely related to E. So we can tell degrees of relatedness still. We can still tell that D is more closely related to E. They're both more closely related to C than they are to B or A. B or A are more closely related to each other. So we can get that, but we don't have any rooting. To root this, essentially what we can do is we pick a point on the tree, let's say here, and essentially you can imagine just taking this and grabbing this and pulling this down to make a root, kind of like this, like actually pulling it. And then now you can essentially see how the tree kind of would come about, is that we have here, and we have a branch here, we have a root here, we have this, and then a branching here, so we get something like this. Does that make sense to you? Is it really confusing to anyone how we got from this, or from this as an unrooted tree, to this being the rooted equivalent? Okay.
Are there ways of doing that wrong? Like
What do you mean doing it wrong?
Like choosing the wrong point for the root? Or is there like an algorithm that always gets you the same point?
So there's this leads to a good point. No, there is not an exact place where you should always place the root, but there is a way of determining where the root should be. And you determine the root usually by using what's called an outgroup, where you get organisms, or an organism, that is outside of this group. However closely all of these are related is more distant than that, but not too far distant. And what that does is then that will connect to this tree at some point. And that then is the root. Does that make sense? That is generally how we root trees.
Can you say that one more time?
What we do is we find a group of organisms that is not within whatever group these are in. So imagine these are all bats. We find something that is not a bat, but is still fairly closely related to bats. And then we create the tree using that, and that then, wherever that connects to the tree, that group is then the root.
Makes total sense.
A lot of groups, a lot of programs will automatically determine a root, and what they will do is to determine that is instead of doing that, they kind of do a faux outgroup, where you take the longest branch, or whichever one is most dissimilar to everyone else. So when you do up your distances, this one is most dissimilar from everything else. And we essentially root it at that organism. So that's another way. It doesn't always give you the best results, but it kind of works. Okay, so let's look at this tree. This is a tree that we've been looking at all the way along here. The unrooted tree for this is this. This is the unrooted equivalent, where again we have B and C are closely related to each other. Next most closely to E, then we have E and F, or D, then we have E and F closely related to each other, and then A out here kind of by itself. let's look at different ways to root this. So I'm going to try this out. So imagine I want to root it right here. Let's actually go through and root that. So going off of this root, the very first thing is we have A out over here. So here's my root. One direction here, we have A. And going off the other direction, then we go and we have this node. That node then leaves two directions, one that goes to EF. And it goes another direction where we have a split, one goes to D and the other goes to BC. So out here. This looks really bad. So D and then BC. So that's essentially our tree reproduced again. Okay, so let's take a look at another example here. Let's root it somewhere totally different. Let's root it right here and see what that does. Okay, so again we have our root, and then going off one direction, going off this direction, we have D. So, okay, here we go. Here is D. Going off the other direction, we have a node. One route goes to BC, the other goes to AEF. So one route goes out to BC, the other route goes out to A and then E and F. So there's A, E, F. Okay. So let's look at this. Look at that tree. And also look at this tree. Those are the same tree with different roots. They look really different. It looks like, from this one, that EF is more closely related to D than it is to A, which it is in this case. And in this other case, EF looks like it's most closely related to A, which in this case it is. But the branching pattern is the same. The only difference is where the root is placed. We placed it here instead of placing it here. Let's do one more. Let's place it, let's place it here on B. So here we have the root again. We have one branch then that goes up and it comes up to B. And then we have the other branch that goes out, and then one side goes to C, other side goes to EF, other side goes to D. Wait, hold on. One side goes to D here. Okay, so, oh! I totally messed this all up. Yeah! Okay. See, it's really small here. We have B. The other side goes to, so we have C, comes up, and then the other side goes to D, A, and then to EF. Okay. This is the right one. Okay, so far, does it make sense how I have arrived at each of these? The branching pattern stays the same. The only difference is where it's rooted. And this is kind of my little plug here. The relatedness patterns in each of these looks very different. In reality, it's not, but your interpretation can be very different depending on where you root a tree. All phylogenetic algorithms end up making a tree that's unrooted. And then it has to root it somewhere. It does that either based on its own internal assumptions that it's going to make, or it's going to do it based on information that you give it, usually with an outgroup or something else like that. And depending on how you root the tree is going to come out very different each way. So be very careful about how you root trees. It's really important and will change your ideas about relatedness. Now, one thing is that you'll notice is that EF almost never came out apart. The only way that you break up groups like that are very closely related to each other is if you root in the middle of that group. Like if we go back EF is together here, EF is together here, EF is together in my crazy one, EF is together here, EF is basically always together. The only way that you break up EF is if you rooted it right here in E or in F. Same thing with BC. So very closely related groups or the minor branches will tend to stay the same, even if you root them differently. The only thing that tends to change is places that are close to the root. Are there any questions on that so far? Okay, so let's continue talking about this just for a little bit. This is what's known as a cladogram. There are several different kinds of phylogenetic trees. One's a cladogram, and this is that. And what you have here is that all the information, essentially most of the information, is stored in the branching pattern of the branches, like the order in which they're in, the way that they're connected. There is generally very little information then in the length of these branches. Oftentimes you can go back, and the depth of the node is interesting because that's the deeper the nodes, the further back in time that's applied. But the actual length of these branches is not particularly informative. This is what's known as a phylogram, another kind of phylogenetic tree. A phylogram, on the other hand, the branch lengths are important. This does carry information. Generally, the information is the number of genetic changes that have occurred between the node and that taxa. And so, for instance, if you look at this, we can tell there's actually more genetic changes between D and B because the distance to go between them is greater than D and C. Likewise, the number of genetic changes between D and F is greater than D and E, and so forth. Okay, so let's come back to this tree just for a moment. The sample CC01 is Philippe Padu, and the CC02 through CC07, which all stands for Collin County, by the way, are all women that he had relationships with. One thing that, and here's another way that you can display a phylogram, is that this is essentially the same thing as that we had before, but instead of having everything laid out linearly, it's laid out to where essentially every axis or every node has a curve to it, so you get it all in a circle. You can compress more information to a smaller amount of space with this. It's nice. So the root now is right here. As we go out, the very first node then splits off into CC01 and then goes off to another node. This node then splits off into CC06 and then off into more. And what you see here in this tree is that you have CC01 showing up here, here, and here, and that each of these now, each of the CC06, 05, 02, 04, 03, and 07 are all nested within CC01. The other thing that's really important here is that they have this group of outgroups right here. These are all completely unrelated, or they were very confident or very unrelated strains of HIV. It's really, again, really important that your rooting is correct in something like this because nesting patterns are very important where you root them to determine nesting patterns. All of these are nested inside there, which what this means now is that this population of HIV arose from within the population of HIV that was residing within Philippe Padu, very likely. Same thing with each of these, because they're nested inside of that population. It's kind of like if you had a family growing up in Virginia forever, and all of these people are in Virginia, and then you take one of them and put them in Idaho for whatever reason. You could go and genetically you could tell that this person from Idaho was from this family in Virginia because they are nested within them. There is the genetic diversity of the family in Virginia still encompasses the genetic diversity that this person represents. So now that only works really well with mitochondrial data because, again, if you have any sort of sexual recombination, it totally muddies this up. Phylogenetic trees assume that we're not having sexual recombination after the splits. that messes everything up. So we can do this really well on mitochondrial data. As you start doing into sexually recombined genes, it becomes more muddy. You have to use slightly different techniques on done like that. Okay. Are there any questions on this so far? Okay, so let's talk about how are trees actually stored as a format. So we've talked about how genetic data is actually stored in FASTA format, Nexus format, other things like this. Let's talk about how is tree information actually stored and transmitted. And the predominant way in which this happens is in what's called Newick tree format. Kind of interesting thing. There was a in the 80s, I think it was. This is named after a restaurant in which several people who were trying to figure out formats of things very early on of phylogenetic things back in the I think the early 80s. They were in Newick's restaurant and they decided just to call it Newick's format. I thought it was cool. Anyways, there's also sometimes called parenthetic format. And this is the most common format in which trees are going to be saved. And the ones that are not this format, like Nexus tree format, in reality are very close to this, just with some modifications. Most of the other ones are essentially modified Newick tree format. And this is like most other exchange formats that we use in genetic data, this is a text format. Each species is going to be separated by a comma. And then you have parentheses that are going to mark which taxa are more closely related to other taxa. So for instance, and then the tree ends with a semicolon. So for instance, if I were to do this, that is a complete tree in Newick tree format. What would that tree look like? Does anyone want to hazard a guess? Yeah, there would be like, what, how?
The B and C would be connected, and then there'd be a separate node. So you'd have A, and then it'd go over, and then there'd be a new node, and it'd be B and C.
So you have A, and then it would go over, and a new node. You have BC? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, oh no, that was wrong. Let's do that. Yeah, so that's essentially exactly what it is. Oh, by the way, with cladograms or phylograms, you can have them vertical, you can have them sideways. The orientation doesn't matter. Also, they don't have to be boxy ends like this. They can also be like this. Exact same thing. No difference here. Okay, so let's add on a little bit of complexity here. If we add another group here, like another parentheses, comma D right there, we get this tree. And then we add, for instance here, so we have that, and then we add comma EF onto here. So it's still contained, but then clade it with these, and then A being outside there, we get this. Which again, you will notice this is like the exact same tree we've been kind of like looking at the entire time. So really, Newick tree format is relatively simple. When you look at them, it gets insanely hard for humans to look at this and actually interpret what the tree looks like. Basically impossible. Oh yeah, it is. And it's like a very, you can get a very big tree into like a fairly simple string of text. Also on top of this, we can store branch links in this as well by actually going in and adding colons after every node and giving a number, and that will store branch links for that particular node. So for instance, if I do this, A:4, B:0.5, C:2, and then this whole node right here, :1, what we get is this, where this is essentially 4 units long. We then have this node, the thing that contains B and C, the branch leading to that is 1 unit long. So we have that right here, that's encoding this one. Branch leading to B is 0.5, so this is half of this, and 1/8 of this. And then C is 2, so then again, this one, this entire length right here is 3/4 of what this is, because we have 1 and then 2, so the entire length out to C is 3. Any questions on that? Okay, so that is how we read and interpret phylogenetic trees. Is also how then do we store that data in something. And next is how do we calculate trees from genetic data. And really there's 4 different principal methods that we've used, kind of going in order of time invented. Simplest is neighbor joining, and then maximum parsimony, maximum likelihood, and Bayesian. And I'm going to go into these on Monday because before I get into that, or before you leave, I want to talk about what I want you to do by tomorrow night. And for this, and this is so we can use this data in lab, I want you to concatenate your 2 sequences that you had if they're good. So the 2 sequences, your HRV1, your HRV2, or HVR1 and HVR2, I want you to put them into one contiguous sequence. And then submit those up onto a Dropbox. I'm going to put Raft class up onto D2L. And here's how, the easiest way to do this is that I'm going to put it up on D2L, and this will be in the content. Again, I'll put this up Raft class, so it'll be easy to find. A data set that's called HVR full data set. And I want you to add your 2 sequences to that full data set. And then open it up in Eugene, and then you can align it. So in this case, where'd my Eugene go? Here we go. I've added person 1. That's you, Matt, right? Do you mind if I just do this on yours real fast? Good stuff, because otherwise I'd have to go back. So you just come in here and you have person 1, you have your HRV1, your HVR2. Keep saying that wrong all the time. I'm going to just align it real fast. And then, yep, align it, please. So you go through and do the whole fun. How it is. So again, you're going to have some ends in here. These should be the quality. As a Nexus file. So save it as a Nexus file. And then what you have here, you should notice that somewhere in here, if you go, they should actually line up. There's overlap between those 2 sequences if it worked right. So Matt, you have a good. And then what you will do then is go in and open up. Did I open it up all right? I think I did. Here it is as a Nexus format. And what you'll notice is you have person 1, your number 1, your number 2, and you have all of that going out. What I do is then slide both number 1 overlaps. So right in here, select a point and just hit Shift and push down key once. And what that will do is that will highlight everything from here to here. And now if I just hit delete, what it will do is pull this up straight up there. So I just do this, hit delete, and now those 2 different sequences have been appended to each other. So we just have the beginning of your HVR1, just the end of your HVR2. And then all the rest of the alignment shows stayed fine. And you look all the way out, then you have, whoo, Control C, get a new thing, hit this, and then just turn it into FASTA format. So all we do is you take that, we just put is greater than sign before this. You can have this all on one single line. That's great and awesome. Don't worry too much about that all being on one single line. And then save this and then upload that. And then before lab, I will take all of those. I am going to then concatenate them into one entire class data set. And then we can do the phylogenetic stuff both on the entire class data set and then also on your your individual stuff with the full data set as well. So we have a couple exercises like that. Are there any questions on that? Yes?
What if you didn't have two good strands, or two good things, what do you do?
Don't worry about it.
Don't do it, like, you don't want me to do someone else's because theirs will already be in there as well?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Like the point of this at this moment is not to make you guys do things, just so that, the point is to get the data so we have it available for that. Yeah. And that I can, the other point here is that, I wanna get the data sets together so I can run them all before lab as well. Because some of these analyses will take too long for some of your computers to do. They will not run them all. Because if alignment took a half an hour, it's never going to run the phylogenetic analysis within the time period of lab. So what I'm gonna do is run the entire analysis myself, get you guys to the point where you can start the analysis, and like, okay, here you start the analysis, and do like the old, cooking show thing, like, and here you go, here is the final product. And now do stuff with this. So I will give you what the output would have been had you run it the entire way, and then now you can. But to be able to do that, I have to have the data set then in sufficient time to run it and get the downloads. So that's really the idea behind this. Behind not just having you guys